Again, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our second presentation during this Lenten program, Sacred Spaces, Sacred Places. Tonight, the Cosmos. And we are absolutely thrilled to have Brother Guy Consolmagno with us, who is the director of the Vatican Observatory. I have to tell you, it is 16 years in the making before I had the courage, and I mean just what I just said, to try and figure out how I was going to invite Brother. In 2002, I was given this book. Brother maybe remember it. Brother Astronomer, Adventures of a Vatican Scientist, published in 2002. I commend the book to you. I commend the book to you. It is absolutely wonderful. There are 2 chapters in there that I think every student at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and around the world should read. They are the 2 chapters that deal with how Brother Guy ultimately got to be a brother and ultimately got to be where he is. His journey took him from Boston College to MIT to Arizona State, to the Peace Corps in Africa, to teach at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, and other places along the way, making his life's journey really interesting. A couple of girlfriends that he left behind, et cetera, et cetera. The 2 chapters are wonderful, absolutely wonderful, as is the rest of the book, but it is a man's journey, a person's journey on where he got to where he is, and that's why we're delighted to have him. So last spring, I said, okay, we're doing the 50th, what are we gonna do? I believe it was at 8:45 in the morning, Eastern time. I sent an email to him, telling him who I was and what we were about. At 9:30 that morning, I had a commitment and a date. He immediately responded and then informed me that he knew some people in the faculty here. A couple of them have now retired since that email transpired, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how he arrived here. It was an email and a prompt response, and then he has been all day with the physics department. He started out at about 11 o'clock with some undergraduates, Charlie Martin for 15 minutes. Charlie Martin's a parishioner, and I did his wedding and all the other stuff, okay? And is a lecturer now on campus. And then with faculty and graduate students, and then ultimately he gave a colloquium this afternoon on campus. So he has had a very full day. And so our presentation tonight. But 2 things before that. In the corridor, there is a box on a table. This is the Liturgy of the Hours from Collegeville, Minnesota. This is this day. Kevin has them. He showed they're there for you. They were sent to us from Collegeville, from the Benedictine Monastery, because Brother Guy writes essays regularly in that. And so take them with you, okay? That's there. He will also push a little later on. There is a sheet of paper there that's looking for your name and address if you want to find out more about the Vatican Observatory. Remember, the Vatican Observatory is in 2 places. It is in Rome, just outside Rome, and it is also just outside Tucson, Arizona. Brother Guy spends winters in Arizona and summers in Rome. So I got to think about that one a little bit, you know? We could talk about that. And then I will tell you one other thing that my brother last night about 9:15 called me. And he said, what's going on? I was telling him, and I said, we went out to dinner. So when we made a decision to go out to dinner, I said to Guy, what do you want to eat? Do you want to do Polish? Do you want to do Tex-Mex? Do you want to do Italian? Do you want to do Chinese? What do you want to do? And he said, well, I don't want to do Italian because I get it in Rome enough. Good. Don't need to do Tex-Mex because I get that in Arizona. a lot. Don't need to do Polish because I get it in Detroit where he's from. Don't need to do Chinese because you get it all over the world. Cool. So what do you want? I want meatloaf. I want meatloaf and mashed potatoes. So we went to the diner on the top of the hill where he had meatloaf and mashed potatoes. So without further ado, my nonsense, Brother Guy Consolmagno.
I never correct people who introduce me, but in this case, you may have heard me clearing my throat. University of Arizona, not Arizona State. Please. Very important. If we can turn down the lights, what I'd like to do is to start with a little film that tells you something not only about the Vatican Observatory, but also, I think, the theme of what I want to talk about today. And I use the film rather than talking because the guy in the movie does it so much better than I can. Both science and religion. There are ways of learning how we interact with this universe. It's not simply a question of is there a God, but there is a God, now what do we do? It's not just a question of there are a bunch of stars, but rather, why are there stars? How do they work? How does that tell us how things work here on Earth? The interaction that I see in my own life is that religion gives me the reason to do the science.
Back in the papacy before Francis was Benedict, and one of his lines in a final elocution to the fathers of the general congregation was, go to the frontiers. Well, there isn't much more frontier than 3.7 billion years away.
The first official interest of the Church for astronomy started in 1582 with the reform of the calendar. Then in 1891, Pope Leo XIII wanted to have an observatory to show that the Church is not against science, but the Church promotes good science.
They start out by having telescopes on the Tower of the Winds, and then on the walls surrounding the Vatican, as the city lights grow, and as the Italian government gives them back their territory after Castel Gandolfo. In the 30s, they built new telescopes on the roof of the Papal Palace in Castel Gandolfo. That's telescopes of their era in the 1930s. By the 1980s, light pollution makes those telescopes unusable, so we built a new telescope in the dark skies of Arizona.
I'm Father Jean-Baptiste Ipoya Eluo. I'm working in 3 projects. The first one is NEOS, Near Earth Object. So what I'm doing with the NEOS is just observe them using our modern telescope BAT. The second project is meteors. Try work on a very faint meteors, what we call shooting stars. And the third project is set fireball network. We will have 4 cameras here around the Tucson so that we can monitor any fireball getting into the Earth atmosphere in the region.
This telescope, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, it was the first of the new technology telescopes that has been considered pretty much the norm now in developing telescopes. With the advance of computer technology, we have the capability of bringing that advanced technology directly into our telescope. So it's an expandable, it's almost like it's a living machine, so it can grow as technology grows. Still very important to maintain scientific research at the Vatican, simply because there is still a lot of confusion about this relationship between science and faith. We're not out here trying to prove the existence of God by looking through a telescope. That's not what we're doing. But we can say that if we want to obtain any reasonable results looking through that telescope,
getting closer to the Creator and getting closer to a universe, as St. Athanasius said 1,500 years ago, was cleansed and quickened by the Incarnation. Then, doing science is an act of worship.
The earth is so very large and the cosmos so very small. The cosmos is about the smallest hole that a man can hide his head in. Chesterton says that in Orthodoxy, and it's a typical example of the kind of paradox that he loves to play with. I'm hoping by the end of this talk you'll have an idea of what he means, that our ideas of the cosmos fit into our heads. The idea of the universe is what we walk in. O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit down, when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and you are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. A friend of mine gave this talk at a place in NASA.
Attitude control manager on NER. Actually, until this morning, I didn't have any idea what Steve was going to talk about. And when he told me the difference between abstract and reality for him, I think you're going to find his story very, very interesting.
Thank you, Farouz. I'm actually just one of the many ACS engineers, kind of our bosses. We all sit on the team. I wanted to tell you a story today about an event that happened a few weeks after the two landings. I'm an attitude control system engineer. I'm responsible for the gyros and the thrusters and the software that keeps the spacecraft or the rover pointed in the right direction. And as such, I lived in this world of numbers. And sometimes it's hard to go from those numbers to the picture of what the spacecraft is doing. But that's kind of the job, is to figure out from the numbers, what direction is the spacecraft pointed today? So a few weeks after the landings, we were kind of in a groove at that point. We were living on Mars time, and so we were coming in at weird hours and not sleeping very well. And so it was the middle of the night, and I was in the control room. I was just coming off shift, and somebody, one of the other engineers, came by the console and kind of just, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Go up to the 6th floor and check out the pictures." And then, he kind of went away. It was kind of like it was a secret, or something special. And so I went up, once I got off shift, I went up to the 6th floor to the UN Conference Center. That's what, a lot of you know the room I'm talking about. It's this large conference room where the science working group
It's a place. There are places in the universe that we haven't set foot on yet. Some places maybe we won't set foot on. But they are places in the universe that are as much God's creation as any place here on earth. What I want to do for a lot of this talk is just put you in those places. The sky is pink because it's filled with dust. Dust as fine as flour, the red dust of Mars. Mars does have air, not very much. In my laboratory, I have a vacuum pump, and my vacuum pump can pump down to the atmosphere of Mars and not much further. But it's enough to support this dust. It's a place, and it's a place that we have visited with our machinery and left our footprints. It's a place filled with sand dunes and rocks. It's a place with cliffs and stratigraphy where you can do actual geology. Only some want to call it areology because it's not the geos we're looking at anymore, but Ares. And with that geology, we can see that it's a place with a history, with rocks that formed, maybe underwater, rocks that are deformed by the stresses inside Mars, rocks that were pulled out by impacts, tossed about as other rocks hit Mars. It's a place. And it reminds us that God's creation is more than just what we see around us here. And God is bigger than just what we see around here. It's a place that follows the same laws of physics and chemistry and the same laws of geology as we've learned here on Earth, and which in fact is teaching us new ways to apply those laws, new laws about places that are a little bit different from what we're used to. Some of these images are new, some of them are more than 15 years old. The spacecraft that Steve was involved in had a 90-day lifetime because they figured after 90 days the dust would cover the solar panels. They discovered that there are little dust devils that clean off the panels. And that spacecraft, that lander, has just celebrated 5,000 days on Mars. And if you think it's impossible that we could ever live there, well, they said that about Arizona, too. So. And we know it not only from the surface, but also by flying over it. And we see marvelous bits of geology, the likes of which we're still arguing about. These streaks, is that caused by actual ice that melts and runs downhill? Or is it carbon dioxide? Or is it just the natural motion of dust? You can find all of that in the literature. But it's a place. And along with everything else, it's a beautiful place with its own sunsets. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord, brother's Son, who brings the day. And you give light through him, and he is beautiful and radiant in all his splendor. Of you most high he bears the likeness. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. There is the moon and a nearby star. The moon, of course, is covering over the sun. This was the eclipse last summer. Be praised, my Lord, through Sister Moon. Sister Moon. This image, sometimes it's called Earthrise. It's not. The Earth is not rising or setting because the moon always keeps that same orientation to the Earth. But the Earth will become crescent and then fully illuminated and then crescent again as the Earth and the moon together go around the sun and the Earth and the moon orbits around the Earth. And the orientation of the Earth in this one is slightly different, not just that it's more full, but this is actually taken over the North Pole of the moon by a Japanese orbiter. There are those who are going to tell you that the moon landings were faked. I've met the guy in that picture. His name is Harrison Schmitt. He was one time a U.S. Senator. He was another time a Harvard geologist. Lives in Albuquerque. When Brother Astronomer came out, they put me on book tour. And I went to Albuquerque to hawk the book, and he showed up. And all of his friends were impressed that he knew this Vatican astronomer, and all of my friends were impressed that I knew this astronaut. I have friends who collect astronaut autographs. I don't have any astronaut autographs, but I know one astronaut who has my autograph. The moon is a place, and it's a place where human beings have walked, even though it's been nearly 50 years since we walked there. We will go back. This is Buzz Aldrin, a picture taken by Neil Armstrong. One of the things that Buzz did when he was on the moon was he took a little chalice, a piece of bread, and he said the Presbyterian communion service. Communion on the... Of course, it was Presbyterian. It's not the real thing, but still. We're human beings. We move to explore, and we do it ultimately in a search for God, in a search for the Creator. That passage I read earlier from the Psalm 137, 139, on no matter where you go, God is there. I thought about that when I went to Antarctica to search for meteorites. We have in this audience the mom of somebody who's been to Antarctica twice, so I'm quite jealous. 4 times? Oh, jeez. I lost track. Now I'm 4 times jealous. But Antarctica is as close as I will ever be to being in a different planet. You land on the ice shelf in these big old airplanes, and then you set up camp after they take you out to the distance where the meteorites are going to be. We went there to search for meteorites. This is where we lived for 6 weeks. This image I took at midnight, looking towards the sun, peering over the South Pole. I was downwind. The wind always comes from the south. And you may ask what I was doing up at midnight. I'll just say when I went back to my tent, there was a little yellow splotch on the ice, and that's why you always go downwind. We had 12 days when we were stuck in our tents because the wind blew a snowstorm in on us. That was one of the most challenging times. And yet, be praised, my Lord, through brothers, wind and air, and cloud and storms, and all the weather, through which you give your creatures sustenance. You'll see I'm mixing up the Francis Laudato Si prayer and the psalm. The way you look for meteorites is quite simple. You get in your skidoos, you go to the areas where the ice is hard and blue, and you keep moving until you find a place where there's a rock on the surface of the ice. And because there's no other place for the rocks to come from, the odds are pretty good it landed there from outer space. Not all the places we went to were nice flat bits of ice. One of the fellows in our group came with ice skates, and he said it's the only time he's ever had to ice skate uphill. You see the little patch of snow there? That is actually covering a crevasse. If you step in that, you may plummet and break your leg or worse. It's like being at the ocean or being at a lake, except the waves are frozen. When it gets cloudy, you can't see the horizon. You can't see shadows, which means you can't see where the ground is, because it's equally illuminated in all directions. And this is when we finally returned to McMurdo Base on our way back. And the ice is finally beginning to break, and ships will be coming in to give the year's supply of food and fuel to the base at McMurdo. You're so bundled up, you have a hard time even recognizing each other. There were little clues. One person had a scarf that he always wore. I had the gaiters there. That's actually me. We were a team of 6, 4 men, 2 women. One of the women was actually Lori Leshin, who I understand has been here at RPI and is now the president of WPI. But that was when she was just out of graduate school. But it's not the only place on Earth that reminds you of places in space. One of the most common features you find on Earth are impact craters, and this is an impact crater. And the photograph I took many different pictures and glued them together, and as I was taking the pictures, this other fellow was walking down into the crater. So you see him many times over. The passage of time. One place that reminds me an awful lot of Mars is Mauna Kea, which has very similar geology, except the skies have a little more clouds and a little more air. Although you're at 15,000 feet, so it doesn't feel like there's nearly enough air there. That's why they have a series of telescopes up there. And of course, the Grand Canyon is a phenomenal place. I don't know if you've had the chance to visit. I finished my thesis in April. My parents came out to see me in Tucson, and we decided to drive back to Michigan. So we went one first day to the Grand Canyon thinking, well, we'll take a look at it, stay overnight, keep going. We immediately extended our stay by several days. It is beautiful, and no photographs do it justice. If I say, surely the darkness will cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you, for the night is as bright as the day. The darkness is as light to you. Sounds like Antarctica, where the sun doesn't set. For it was you who formed my inward parts, you who knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. This is the sun with planet Venus passing in front of it. A telescopic view taken from the roof of the Vatican Observatory during the transit of Venus in 2004. And just as Venus was exiting, He had a solar filter, so you could actually see a solar prominence behind Venus. There's Venus again, as imaged by a Russian lander. You may never have seen these pictures before because the original Russian pictures were very distorted. With modern computers, amateurs have gone back and restored many of the old spacecraft images, including this one of Venus. The image, the color of the sky is because the atmosphere is so thick that only the yellowest of light can get through, and it goes through sulfur clouds. The Russians put 2 landers on Venus. Both of them stopped functioning after about 20 minutes because the temperature is 700 degrees and the atmospheric pressure is 100 times the pressure here on Earth. And the air is full of carbon dioxide and droplets of sulfuric acid. We go beyond, on the other side of Earth, to Mars, our nearest neighbor. You saw Mars before in all those images from the surface. This is from orbit, where you can see that Mars has a little moon. In fact, 2 little moons like this, orbiting it. You continue out beyond Mars to the asteroid belt. This is asteroid Vesta, where I gave a talk this afternoon for about an hour talking to people about asteroid Vesta. So just as a warning, don't get me started. This is Jupiter, and Jupiter at a very special time. The splotches indicate the places where the broken up pieces of comet Shoemaker-Levy hit Jupiter, 1994. We showed a picture like this and gave it to Pope John Paul II during an audience soon afterwards. And he was stunned, and all he could say was, "Bless you and bless your comets." Jupiter has 4 large moons. The closest one, Io, is shown here. And you see the little yellow or bluish splotch to the north? Io has volcanoes spewing out sulfur gas. And as a result, the surface is very yellowish. And on the surface, you can see the volcanoes erupting. Io is also a place. How many people have ever seen Saturn through a small telescope? Is there anybody here who's ever seen Saturn and not gone, "Oh, wow"? Well, this is a view you would not see from your little telescope. Obviously, because we're seeing Saturn not head on, but from the side, the sun is off to the left, and is it left where you are? I think, yeah. And so you can see the shadow of Saturn on its rings, and the rings look funny because we're seeing not just the light reflected back, but the light scattered by dust in between the bright rings that we see from our point of view. And with its moon Titan, and the rings edge on. Titan again with the rings, and 2 other moons, a small moon that shepherds the rings, and I believe that's Mimas. It might be Tethys. I forget which it is. Titan itself is a place with an atmosphere twice as thick as Earth's atmosphere, but a temperature of only 100 degrees above absolute zero. You're going to say, is that Celsius or is that Fahrenheit? At that temperature, it doesn't matter. When we sent the Cassini orbiter around Saturn, which took those pictures, piggybacked along with it was the Huygens lander. The one was made by the American Space Agency, the other by the European Space Agency. Huygens parachuted through the atmosphere of Titan and landed on its surface. And the rocks you see there are probably chunks of ice, but so cold that they are hard as rock. And the rings are just astonishing. This is a moon called Iapetus, very puzzling when you observe it from Earth because it seems so much brighter on one side than on the other, until you get close and you realize one side is covered with dark dust, which is apparently chipped off another moon further out, spirals in towards Saturn, and gets collected on the leading side of this moon. But Iapetus, it turns out, is fascinating for another reason. It's got this groove along its equator. Now, these are NASA images that were stitched together by a computer to show the different aspects and to make a little movie that helps you visualize this place. What we're looking at is a surface of ice. Ice which, for whatever reason, has formed a ridge around its equator. This one always makes me dizzy. Look where we've been. Look at what we have seen. None of these are artists' renditions. These are images of what's really out there right now. One of the most exciting discoveries was a moon called Enceladus. 45 years ago, when I was a student at MIT, I did a thesis predicting that there would be liquid water oceans beneath the crusts of some of these moons. All my calculations were wrong, by the way, but I got the right answer anyway. The Cassini spacecraft showed that there is actually a geyser of water several hundred kilometers tall squirting out of the south pole of Enceladus. Be praised, my Lord, through Sister Water. She's useful and humble and precious and pure. This might be a captured comet, also in orbit around Saturn. It's got the wonderful name of Hyperion, which is the way we pronounce it in English because Shakespeare made us do that. The correct Greek would be Upurion, I think. And this is a marvelous image of Saturn from exactly behind, because light passing through dust illuminates the dust. Anybody who's ever tried cleaning a house and you have a shaft of light coming through the window, suddenly you see all the dust in the air. That's what's happening here. We're behind Saturn looking back at the sun, and all of the dust in the rings, including the dust that is shaped into little comet-like plumes, all of that is now visible. And the bright rings that we can see from Earth reflecting light back at us now look like dark rings shadowing the sunlight from reaching us. But there's something else in this picture. Look carefully at Saturn, and if you consider Saturn to be the face of a clock, look at the rings at about 9:30, 10 o'clock. You'll see a thin ring outside the bright rings and a tiny dot of light just below the thin ring, right there. Do you see it? That's us. That's planet Earth. Be praised, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth. There it is. There it is. There it is. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. I try to count them. They're more than the sand. I come to the end, and I'm still with you. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. We move now away from our solar system and out into the cosmos. Our galaxy is a group of 100 billion stars, a billion light years, well, not 100,000 light years across. And circling around the center are these clusters of 100,000 stars called globular clusters, which contain apparently some of the oldest stars in the universe. And we've figured out how to measure their ages. And we figured out how to measure their motions. And we figured out from them how we think they might even have formed. Be praised, my Lord, through the stars. In the heavens you have made them bright, precious, and beautiful. But we're not the only galaxy out there. And in fact, galaxies come in clusters. And not every galaxy in the cluster is going to look alike. And the galaxies interact with each other, ripping the galaxies apart, like that galaxy shaped like an S. Some of the research being done here at RPI in the physics department explores how that happens in our own Milky Way. This is the Whirlpool Galaxy. It was named that by the Irishman who found it in what was then the largest telescope in the world, in the center of Ireland. Why would anybody build a telescope where it's always cloudy and rainy? But that's where he was living, that's where he wanted this telescope. And it's glorious because attached to it is another galaxy. If you want to know where it is, the idea is to look where the Milky Way is, and then look to the north and see the Big Dipper. If you know the handle of the Big Dipper, this galaxy is just off the handle, and you can find it in a small telescope if you know where to look. Galaxies interact with each other. This remarkable image was not made by Hubble, was not made by a professional telescope. It was made by an amateur, Jay Gabani, in New Mexico, using the kinds of cameras that amateurs can use now. And because he's got a wider field of view than the professional telescopes, he can see the details of one galaxy that's passed through another and had its stars ripped apart. This is a star that has exploded, puffed out a ring of gas. Actually, it's a sphere of gas. This image was taken with our own Vatican telescope, the one that you saw in the movie. And this is a Hubble image. As is this. You can see it as a wonderful unicorn, or you can see it as a place where stars are being formed. The ear of the horse that has a little bright dot at the end, that's a cloud of gas that's been hit by a supernova shock, and at that point, the gas has been compressed into a disk, which in a few 100 million years will be producing planets. And this is an image, a Hubble image. It's not a painting. It's not somebody's crazed imagination. It is what is actually out there. Most of these images you can find online, by the way, and if you really love images, go search for something called the astronomy picture of the day. Open clusters like this is what people at the Vatican Observatory study. I think this is, again, one of our images. Because these are where stars have been born and planets are being born. And finally, speaking of stars, this is a detail of our own star, the sun, of a solar telescope in the Canary Islands. Be praised, my Lord, through brother Fire, through whom you brighten the night. He's beautiful and cheerful and powerful and strong. From the large, I end by going to the smallest. I work with meteorites, rocks that have fallen to Earth. And when you have a meteorite and slice it 10 microns thick, thinner than your hair, and shine light through it with polarizations, you can see the details of the different crystals, which you can also see with a little bit of imagination as the head and body of a baby. We used this image one year for our Christmas card. I'll end again with something Chesterton wrote in Orthodoxy. The essence of all pantheism is that nature is our mother. But the main point of Christianity is this: nature is not our mother, nature is our sister. Nature was a solemn mother to the worshippers of Isis and Cybele, to Wordsworth and to Emerson. But to St. Francis, nature is a sister and even a younger sister, a little dancing sister to be laughed at as well as loved. The spirit of St. Francis, the spirit of Laudato Si, echoed in Pope Francis's encyclical, reminds us this creation, these places, were made by God as you and I were made by God, and that means that we are siblings. And to deface nature is to deface your little sister. To exploit nature, willy-nilly, is to exploit your little sister. Pope Francis reminds us that the stars are not gods to be worshipped. We don't worship nature. Neither are they innate objects to exploit. They are gifts and signs of the Creator. Since the beginning of time, God has revealed himself in the things he's made. That's not me saying that, that's St. Paul. Letter to the Romans, chapter 1.
Why does the Vatican have an astronomical observatory? For instance, you're the curator of meteorites at the Vatican. Why do they curate meteorites? Are they looking for the shooting star of David? What?
No, in fact, the whole idea of having astronomers really got started with the reform of the calendar back in the 1500s. And since then, just studying the universe is a great way to remind yourself that there's more important things in life than what's for lunch.
What is for lunch?
So if you can pull up the lights, I'm going to end with two stories. The first goes to that question of why we have an observatory, and indeed, why it is that I do astronomy. When I was a young man, I was turning 30 and suddenly feeling not so young anymore. I'm in my 60s now. And I thought, my life is slipping away, and I've been spending all of my energies studying the moons of Jupiter, to write a paper that 5 people will read and 2 of them are my enemies. Why do I bother? Is this the proper way for a grown human being to waste his life? And I had no answer for that. Why should I be doing this kind of astronomy when people are starving in the world? So I quit. There's no problem so big you can't run away from it. And I joined the Peace Corps. And I went off to Africa, and I said, I'll go anywhere you want me to go. Do what you think I should do. I'm here to serve you. And they said, great, we'll put you in a school up country where there's no black on the blackboards, no windows in the windows. I said, yeah, that's great. And after a week, they took a look at my degree and said, well, maybe we'll put you in a better school than that. By the end of training, they had assigned me to the best high school in the country that had computer labs, 1983, and they had computer labs, lasers in their laboratories, best students in the country. And I stayed there for one term, and then they moved me to the University of Nairobi, where I taught graduate students astrophysics, which I could have done back in Boston. But every weekend I'd go up country. I had a little telescope with me, and I'd set up the telescope at night, and everybody in the village, to visit my friends who were in the real Peace Corps. And everybody, I'd show slides and talk about astronomy, and everybody's fascinated by looking at these pictures, and their reaction is exactly the same as yours. I didn't have exactly these pictures, but similar. And then I have the little telescope, and they'd all look through the telescope, and they'd look at the moon, and they'd see the craters, and they'd go, wow. And they'd look at Saturn, and they'd see the rings, and they'd go, wow. And I'm thinking, this is what happens when I set up the telescope back in Michigan. This is what human beings do. You look at the sky, and you go, wow. Now, I had a cat in those days, a very clever cat, much better at being a cat than I would have been. But my cat never wanted to look through the telescope. And it finally hit me. This is what makes us more than just well-fed cats. Looking at the sky and wondering. Looking at the sky and wanting to know. Looking at the sky and then finding people who have also looked at the sky and joining in on the conversation about what are those things? What have we learned? What more could we learn? Because we can all be part of that conversation. And you go to a place like RPI to learn the language that we're talking and to learn what are the questions we're talking about this week so that you can join in on that conversation next week. And that makes us human. And the people in Kenya who were starving for food were also starving for this because we don't live by bread alone. I'd read that someplace. And that's why we do astronomy. Because we are hungry for more than food, and we need to be nourished. I'll end with one other story, though. Years ago, I was cruising through the internet looking for something, and I stumbled across an article by a journalist in England. I think she writes the gardening column for The Independent, something like that. Her name is Emma Townsend. And as a good journalist, she is very good at writing. And she happened, for whatever reason, to write a short article about her childhood growing up. And like many little girls, she loved Daddy. She thought her dad was the greatest thing going. It's one of those things you hope happens, a relationship between fathers and daughters. Dad was away on business a lot. But when he came home, it was the greatest thing, and he was an incredibly loving father, and she just thought he was, a star. When she got to be about 11, some way, I forget how, she learned that her daddy, Pete Townsend, really was a rock star. He was the lead guitarist for The Who. And the reason he was away because he was on tour and millions of people were coming to hear him perform. And I thought that's what we're like. When we're children, we learn to pray, Our Father, because God is Daddy to us. Abba, Father. Abba is what a little baby says. Abba, Abba. But then we learn that the daddy who we love as a daddy is also the fellow who is responsible for all that stuff we just saw. And you go, wow, what a great daddy I've got. What a great daddy we all have. Thank you a whole lot for sharing with me the chance to show these pictures. Thank you. So, I've managed to eat up an hour. I know people have places to go. If you need to leave, I won't feel offended. If you want to stay for a few minutes for questions, I'm happy to do that. And I'll take questions about anything from, living at the Vatican, what does the Pope have for breakfast? I have no idea. Or some of the images you saw there. Yes, in the back. Right.
Have you yourself had any observational experiences in your explorations that had like a specific observational experience that had a big impact on your spiritual outlook, or was sort of outwardly meaningful?
Yeah, but it's hard to describe. I think being in Antarctica and seeing the countryside and suddenly having this disconnect. After a while, you think this is the only universe there is, me and these 5 other people, me and these 3 tents. And it's so breathtakingly beautiful. And the air is so clean, you forget what air is supposed to taste like. Moments looking through a telescope. Soon after Antarctica, I went back to Christchurch, New Zealand, and set up my telescope to look at stuff in the southern hemisphere that you never get to see. And by accident stumbled upon the Eta Carina, which was not on my list of things to look at because the guy would give me the list of, oh yeah, forgot to tell you about that. And it was breathtaking. It was an oh wow moment. Some of them were subtle. I did some research where, it took me a week to do every data point, but finally I had about 100 data points and plotted them up and plot this version against that version, and suddenly I saw a pattern that I didn't expect. And I thought there were going to be, 5 people in the world who care. But it was beautiful. And that sense of discovery, that I've seen a little thing, and it's like the voice of God behind me going, yeah, isn't that cool? You got it. Let me show you the next one. Because he's playing this game with me like a mom plays a game with a kid. And exactly. Join common pieces, and you wind up with a second-order differential equation in space is equal to the second-order differential in time with a constant. And before I'd gone any further, because this turns out to be a really cool thing, but most people don't recognize it, but before I'd said a thing, a kid in the front row looks at that equation and suddenly recognizes what that equation is, and he says for the entire class to hear, oh my God, it's a wave. And this is what Maxwell had discovered. That electricity and the electric field and magnetism, the magnetic field, when you take the equations that describe them and put them together, you suddenly have electromagnetic waves, and the constant turns out to be the speed of light. And you suddenly know what light is. It's an electromagnetic wave. And you suddenly realize that you can create your own waves, maybe at a lower frequency, that will radiate out in all directions, the Italian word radio for radius. Marconi figured that one out. And you can use these equations to transmit power from Niagara Falls to New York City. And in fact, all of 20th century physics came out of the, oh my God, it's a wave moment. I had that as a student, and I was hoping that I could spring it on the kids. But this guy got it all by himself. And his joy was nothing like my joy as a teacher, seeing that happen. So you get those bursts of joy in lots of different places. But C.S. Lewis described it in Surprised by Joy. That's where you have the finger of God. It's the same experience. Other questions? Other experiences? Yeah.
I will end it here, but on behalf of the crowd, if you want to have an experience tonight, huh? Well, that's all we can say.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.